News on Sunday is a socialist publication.
News on Sunday believes that everybody has the right to the basic necessities.
News on Sunday will support the right to self-determination of all peoples.
News on Sunday
recognises that Britain is a society based on the unequal ownership of wealth, prosperity and power.
News on Sunday will be internationalist in outlook.
News on Sunday... I'm sorry, I just can't take this seriously, I'm very sorry.
News on Sunday believes that the root cause of the present troubles in Ireland is the British presence in that country.
News on Sunday will support workers and their trade unions when they take industrial action.
News on Sunday opposes the imposition of suffering on animals. I'm sorry.
By the mid-80s, the left in Britain was on its knees.
Can we keep close together, please? 5 or 6 wide.
Thatcher was riding high, having swept to power for a second term. The miners had been defeated after a year-long strike. Large parts of the state sector were being put in private hands, and unemployment had reached 3 million. Faced with the tabloid press as right-wing as the government, committed left-wingers began to wonder whether they could rally support for their cause if only they could publish their own newspaper.
At the time, you're talking about a newspaper environment where Mrs. Thatcher was queen, and there were very, very few newspapers or media attacking her outright, and even that which might have, the Daily Mirror at the time, was run by Robert Maxwell. So I do feel the left didn't feel it had anywhere to go in the media.
We needed a paper that would tell the truth. It might be seen as our truth, what do you mean by truth? But it was going to be the truth. At least there was going to be another side of the argument, Paul.
There were significant kind of people on the left, councils, trade unions, etc., who felt that Thatcherism had been, an enormous period of defeat for the left. And it would be good to have something that was pushing over left-wing ideas, campaigning against kind of growing poverty, against homelessness, against unemployment. People felt that that would be, good for the left and might help, give the left some renewed confidence.
OK, ready. Let's do it.
The left-wing tabloid that would eventually emerge from these debates was News on Sunday. It launched in April 1987 and went bankrupt just 2 months later. It was one of the boldest and most expensive business ventures ever attempted by the far left in Britain. And it was a disaster. Alan Hayling was the man behind it. Hayling had left Cambridge University with a double first and was a member of a small left-wing faction called Big Flame.
Big Flame was a Marxist organisation, and hence it saw working class struggle, working class action, working class consciousness as being key to getting rid of inequality in society. And so it had quite a big focus on working alongside, working with working class organisations.
In In 1976, after a brief stint on the BBC's graduate trainee scheme, Hayling got a job as a production worker on the Ford assembly line.
Those of us in Big Flame had quite a rank and file perspective in everything that we did. So I ended up working for what I thought was going to be 3, 4, 5 months in Slough at the Langley truck plant.
Well, there weren't any things like Big Flame Directive, you shall go and work on the shop floor. There's nothing like that. There were people who did those kind of things to remove themselves from the ivory tower of wherever they were and get a sense of what it was like on the front line and to do what they could there.
Alan never ever let on that he'd had a particular degree. He'd never... It didn't seem important.
As it turned out, Hayling stayed on the assembly line for 8 years. While he was there, he mobilised Ford workers in their struggles with management and even sang backing vocals on this strikers' song.
And it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? You can stop your 5%, 'cause that won't pay the rent. And it's 5, 6, 7, picketing the factory gates. It's 1 in the eye for Sonny Jim. Whoopee, we're gonna win.
While Hayling was living the political life at Ford, Keith Sutton, who had a working-class background and had left school at 16, was working on Fleet Street. He was dreaming of a life of political activism.
After it was about 10 years of Fleet Street, I took a year out, and I guess, if you like, that was the beginning of a more political awakening in me.
His background, I mean, he'd been a traditional young go-getting reporter who'd done very well, got into Fleet Street, but had eventually decided that he didn't like what he was doing and had opted out. So he had a very radical streak to him.
I was involved in direct action community politics, would be the best way to describe it. I was involved in the campaign to restore cheap fares to the buses, so we hijacked a bus in the name of democracy. Another event that I recall was taking over Centre Point in the name of the homeless.
In the early 80s, Hayling gathered around him a group of like-minded left-wingers, including former Maoist and fellow Big Flamer Henry Stewart and revolutionary socialist John Hoyland. Drawing on their analysis of class consciousness, they decided to try and develop a mass-market left-wing newspaper.
It was to be a tabloid. It was going to be, you know, the first tabloid-size, fairly serious newspaper.
As far as its politics was going to be concerned, it was not going to represent any particular left-wing sect or party or anything like that. It was going to be oppositional, it was going to be campaigning, but it was also going to be have ideas in it.
It was about actually having a radical newspaper that would expose things in society, that would make a difference, that would be a rallying call for people. It was a very exciting idea. Instead of going on one more demo or doing some more leaflets, actually looking at where opinion is formed and playing a central part there.
This initial group of socialists, libertarians and revolutionaries now sat down and spelt out their programme of left-wing beliefs. The document they wrote became a set of rules that was to be the newspaper's editorial charter.
News on Sunday believes that everybody has the right to the basic necessities, such as housing, education and healthcare,
in the form of public services and a minimum income sufficient to maintain a decent standard of living.
News on Sunday recognises the dangers of damaging the ecological balance of the world. The paper will advocate the conservation of natural resources, habitats and species, and will support appropriate campaigns and movements.
With grants from the GLC and the Greater London Enterprise Board, Hayling and his friends put together a dummy newspaper to illustrate their left-wing vision. The dummy was market researched, and the thrilling news came back that the paper could expect to sell over 1 million copies a week. But before they went in search of investors, Hayling realised they needed a proper journalistic figurehead on board. In an audacious move, he decided to get in touch with the best-known campaigning left-wing journalist he could think of.
In the late 1950s, I was a young journalist working as a shipping reporter on the Sydney Daily Telegraph. This meant that I was a witness to an extraordinary migration of human beings from one end of the earth to the other. It's an epic story not often told, its heroes often unsung.
You know, I enjoyed watching his television programmes. I thought it was great. I'd never met him. And I phoned him up.
I was to be the, I suppose I was to be the main journalist ingredient in the whole enterprise.
Doing their best to seem credible, the fledgling News on Sunday team now headed for the city to raise the £6.5 million they would need to launch the paper.
We all wore suits and ties and looked as smart as we possibly could for that operation.
Had you worn suits before?
I don't think I'd ever worn a suit in my working life up to that point.
We kind of dressed the part, or we tried to dress the part, with enormous difficulty in my case, but we managed. And we had a good case to make.
The people who weren't giving money was anyone in the city. But they weren't interested at all. The people that were interested, that took it up with the local authorities, the trade unions, individuals, the cooperative movement, these kinds of people.
Nearly £4 million came from local authority pension funds and over £1.5 million from trade unions. The Transport and General Workers Union was the biggest single investor and gambled over £500,000.
We needed to raise 6.5 million. We actually raised, I think it was 6.2. So we're at the last day frantically, I was ringing round. We had this list of individuals I was ringing round trying to get money to people who were so close.
More people come to Oystons to sell their home than to any other estate agent in the north.
Amongst those that put up the remaining money was Owen Oyston, a former actor who'd made his millions out of selling property in the northwest.
£100,000. It could be you!
With Oyston's money in the bag, News on Sunday had the capital to go ahead. They were now in business.
Come on. Inside, minutes later, the celebrations. John Pelger, favourite for the editor-in-chief's chair, was justifiably euphoric.
How do you feel? Very good. Beginning of the first radical newspaper in this country for 30 years.
Somebody's got to make a speech about now that all...
So this evening, the left in Fleet Street had, for once, something to be thankful for. The News on Sunday should publish on the first Sunday in April, assuming, they say, that's not April Fool's Day.
It's the News on Sunday.
One of the great beliefs on the left was that a radical venture could never get the money together. Well, we were an idea for a radical campaigning newspaper, and we raised £6.5 million. We shattered that myth. I mean, that was an incredible achievement.
Clearly, we weren't people trapped in a particular left-wing bubble who weren't able to think in different ways. We were people who were very entrepreneurial.
The News on Sunday was the extreme left's first attempt to enter mainstream public life. This was uncharted territory. The left-wingers in charge realised they would need to safeguard their socialist dream and make sure it would never fall prey to right-wing capitalists.
It was going to be important to protect the editorial direction of the newspaper, and in particular to prevent the editor being sacked.
In an unprecedented move, they handed a controlling interest over to a collective made up of the paper's target audience, the proletariat. Hayling first approached a former comrade from Ford. John Bohanna was a trade unionist there and was an activist in the Socialist Workers' Party.
Alan began to tell me that I would be something to do with protecting the paper, and I said, smashing. A Sunday socialist worker, OK, you could temper down its politics if they wanted to a little bit and put a crossword in. But why not have that?
bumped into John Boanna. And he said, "Do you want to get involved in a Sunday newspaper?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "'Cause you're black." I said, "All right."
Unusually for the left, News on Sunday was determined to be non-sectarian and invited Stalinists, Trotskyites, libertarians and the non-aligned to work together for the greater good. Mike Power was a Fleet Street print worker who'd been active in the trade union movement for many years.
They spotted me, as it were, because I was involved in the campaign for press freedom and I was a member of the Communist Party, and they asked me to come along as a kind of an advisor helper.
I didn't have a background in the media. You know, I was a youth worker. It was more to do with playing a small part in the development of a newspaper which could hopefully have an impact on dismissal of Margaret Thatcher at the time.
This group of people were to be called the Founders. They owned what was known as the Golden Share, which meant they had final say over the hiring and firing of the editor and could oppose any change in ownership of the paper.
Basically, sitting on a table with the founders was like sitting around the tables of the founding fathers of America, if I can put it so boldly. And that is that they were from all various, they were from different backgrounds, a variety of educations and skills, but all had a common theme, and that common theme was wanting to change Britain for the better. The paper will support people fighting to free their countries from foreign occupation, from racist regimes, or from any form of dictatorship.
News on Sunday recognises that Britain is a society based on the unequal ownership of wealth, prosperity and power.
And will seek to inform the readers of such inequalities, their causes and effects.
One of the most high-profile and violent industrial disputes of the mid-80s was Wapping. Rupert Murdoch had sacked 5,000 of his workers and moved production of The Sun, The Times and The Sunday Times to a new high-tech plant in Wapping in East London. Sacked workers picketed the new plant for many months, and journalists who refused to make the move to Wapping set up a strike newspaper called the Wapping Post. Keith Sutton was the editor.
Keith had been, was one of the refuseniks, the Wapping refuseniks, the people who wouldn't go down there. He'd been working at the Sunday Times on that occasion. And Keith became editor of the Wapping Post, which was started by the print unions. It was a sort of campaigning paper which was pounding the Murdoch press.
We would have things like page 3 stunner with the female riot cop carrying a truncheon with page 3 stunner over it. Then we'd have page 5 shy guy, and the policeman would have his numbers off, you know. So it was kind of using humour to show some pretty serious stuff. And I sort of put it all together, and it was a great success. Great success. But here we were in the 8th or 9th month of this horrific dispute, and you know, the reality of defeat was beginning to appear, I suppose, at that time. And so I would have been thinking about, you know, what was I going to be doing next?
In August 1986, News on Sunday advertised for an editor who would report to John Pilger, the editor-in-chief. With his radical credentials and heroic status as editor of the Wapping Post, Keith Sutton seemed the ideal candidate.
Keith got the job because he reassured us that he would produce a paper that fitted with the dream.
I asked where he was from. When I was told he was the editor of Wapping Post, I was delighted because I thought the Wapping Post was a great paper, and Keith Sutton was going to unleash an unholy war in the name of decency. And I thought, that'll do me. That will do me.
You had edited the initial dummy. Did you think that maybe you should be the editor?
I think in my heart of hearts, I thought I should be the editor. But, you know, I don't think that anybody suggested it, and I never pushed myself forward. But I guess I wished that I'd been asked.
In the first of a series of ill-fated decisions informed by left-wing dogma, News on Sunday took the unexpected decision to base itself not in Fleet Street, but 200 miles away in Whitworth Street in Manchester.
The idea was that the newspaper would, as well as being radical and campaigning, would also represent a different viewpoint, wouldn't be so London-based. The idea that there are a lot of people outside London who are actually quite annoyed by the way their news is all from a London perspective. It sounded like a great idea.
It was part of the overall philosophy, I think, of devolution and not being sort of London-focused and things. There was a strong sort of idea of sort of regionality that a lot of the people wanted to introduce into the paper.
To actually base a national publication of that kind with its office in Manchester made no sense at all. When the whole media world was in London, when politics that mattered nationally was in London and so on, really didn't make sense at all. For me, it was a key error. Although in the end I went along with it because one of the things I learned as a member of the Communist Party was how to function in a system of democratic centralism where once a decision's taken, if you're defeated, then you go along with it.
With 4 months to go till launch, the process of recruiting staff began.
I thought Alan Aylan knew everybody in the world, so we were going to get the best. You know?
The paper needed experienced journalists, not enthusiastic amateurs. And I was using my contacts and friendships with people to persuade them to come over.
He gave me this list of people I can remember fairly early on once we got started, who he thought would be great to have on board. You know, one or two of them I'd heard of, I knew. A lot of them I didn't. Some of them were in New York. Some of them were authors of books on Northern Ireland, I think. He was going off to Australia to make a film. He said he'd be filming for, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months, and he would be in touch from Australia, really, and left me to get on with recruiting.
Hindus have the Ganges, Australians have their beach. And this is Bondi, my beach.
There was a very idealistic recruitment policy. They were trying to adopt best practice. And so the decision was made to have a very kind of fair and egalitarian recruitment process.
Mostly in journalism, you get jobs in a very nepotistic and old boy network type of way. So this was quite a radical departure.
Not many black people at that time worked in Fleet Street because the journalists that I knew didn't have any contacts on Fleet Street. So it was very, very difficult to get into those newspapers. When News on Sunday started, what it did, which was kind of revolutionary at the time, was that they advertised jobs.
An extraordinary advert appeared in The Guardian. It just said, "We need journalists," or something like that. It wasn't very specific.
You had everybody and their dog writing in. You had people who were writing in because the politics sounded good. You had people writing in just because they wanted a job. This was a time of very high unemployment.
We had every person who'd ever had a left-wing thought in his head applying. You know, every student, every quasi-journalist, everybody who seemed to be a member of any group with more than 8 people in it applied to News on Sunday.
But they were arriving in sacks. There weren't the trained professionals in place to sift through and assess these applications for jobs that weren't specified. So we picked out the ones that had been done on the Amstrad, and we binned the rest.
There are people out there who probably detest me to this day for never answering. I'm sorry, we never got to hear of you. I mean, we were avalanched.
We did a lot of encouraging people from unrepresented groups, like we advertised in the black press, as well as advertising in the straight press, the Press Gazette and all the rest of it. And then I got in touch with a lot of local ethnic minority groups, and I got in touch with the disablement resettlement officers about means to encourage people with disabilities to apply for jobs.
Now, the problem with that really is that in a creative business you can only do that up to a certain point, because you need to go looking for people who have certain abilities in certain areas. You know, I mean, columnists whose names are known to the public.
You were not going to get a large proportion of women from ethnic minorities as highly qualified sub-editors. You just weren't going to. You certainly weren't going to get design sub-editors who were either women from ethnic minorities and or disabled. Forget it. No way.
Well, on the disablement side, I was strongly advised that one of the best things to do was to have a critical mass of people with the same kind of disability, because they could then communicate with each other and share their experiences together. So we made the post room a room for deaf people. And that's it. They looked after all the mailings, and of course they could drive, because deaf people can drive perfectly well, and so they did all the distribution of the papers. And I think that was very, very successful, because they all could sign and talk to each other, and we always got signers in if there was a meeting along with people who were not deaf. And there was a sort of camaraderie about that. News on Sunday is opposed to all forms of sexism, racism and all discrimination which denies the capabilities and potential of the individual.
News on Sunday will express its commitment to anti-racism and anti-sexism both in the employment practices and in its news and feature coverage.
It will reflect the multicultural composition of British society.
Best-selling novelist Val McDermott was an experienced tabloid journalist at the time. She applied for the job of news editor.
I do think that one of the mistakes that News on Sunday made at several points in the editorial appointment process was to make decisions based on politics rather than ability. And I know that sounds like sour grapes, but I had far more practical experience than Colton Lee, who was appointed as news editor, who had never worked for a national newspaper. But, he was black, and we didn't have very many black people in editorial. So I think that was something that informed the decision, white lesbian, black man, tough call.
Do you think you did have the experience to run as you say, a frantic national news desk from start-up?
Did I have the experience? I would say, did I have the experience to run a frantic news desk? I would say, in a conventional sense, no. But given that my whole journalistic experience had been about looking at the news and reporting, news in a very different way, reporting news stories or covering news stories from a perspective that was not the norm, I was probably more experienced than most of the other people working on the paper, actually.
Everybody seemed to end up with a job they hadn't done before. Was there some notion that if you wanted to do something in a different way, it's a good idea to put people in posts who haven't done it before?
No, not at all. In fact, I think that's kind of a bit unfair. Actually, where people had to have a particular knowledge base, I think they had a particular knowledge base.
I was head of personnel and equal opportunities.
And had you done that job anywhere before?
No.
Had you ever been foreign editor on a national paper before?
I'd never been foreign editor of any national newspaper.
Did you have any experience of working on a tabloid?
No, I'd never worked on a national tabloid.
Had you ever worked on a tabloid before?
No.
And had you ever worked in personnel before?
No.
Had you ever been editor-in-chief of a national newspaper?
No.
Had you ever been sales director on a national newspaper?
Never.
Had you been the editor of a national newspaper before?
No.
You said you knew how to do spreadsheets, but you'd never actually worked within a company, looking after the finances of a company before in that way?
No.
So you'd never had a job in computing before?
No.
Had you actually had a job in marketing ever before?
No, but again, It's the sort of skill you pick up.
You became the chief executive.
I became the chief executive.
Was that a job you'd ever done before?
No.
As the recruitment process came to an end, Pilger returned from Australia and discovered, to his horror, that none of the journalists he'd recommended had joined the paper.
John Pilger completely floored me by saying that I was out to destroy him, that I was, trying to take over the project and leave him out of it. Well, if anybody had been left out in the cold or the heat of the Australian desert, it was him, because he'd gone there.
He told me that he was the editor, and he wasn't acknowledging me as editor-in-chief. Told me straight out. He said, you're not even going to have an office there. It was a straight, I'm in, you're out. This was a coup d'etat. Not much equal opportunity there.
With his team of newly employed journalists, Keith Sutton began producing dummy papers. What the dummies revealed was that his vision for the paper was at odds with the serious left-wing dream of the paper's creators.
We would have lots of humour, with lots of lively pages, lots of pictures, and did not, and this is important, did not want to push politics so openly down people's throats.
Keith Sutton had begun producing dummies, and frankly they were terrible. And they alarmed me and they alarmed John Pilger. And so what was agreed was that John and I would produce a different dummy, and then people could decide. And so we produced our few pages, and they were very, very different.
Did he know you were producing a rival?
Oh, yes. This was done very openly. This was not done behind the scenes. This was proper decisions,
Him and Alan Hayling produced their own rival dummy. Unbeknown to you?
Totally unbeknown to me. There was no way it was done in any constructive form. It was done in a way to hit not just me at that time, but the whole editorial enterprise in Manchester.
So that was very undermining?
Absolutely, yeah. It was totally destructive, and that was the intention.
Can you explain why you did that? And I suppose there's an argument that, it was rather undermining of the editor you'd appointed.
Well, he had to be undermined. It was a dreadful dummy. The whole thing had to be undermined, stopped. There are millions of pounds of people's money, of little people who'd given to this, trade unionists. The moment Alan and I saw that initial dummy, we knew it was a disaster.
In democratic News on Sunday style, the two rival dummies were presented to the board and to the Founders Committee.
My reaction, without any comedy to it, was that I thought Keith was joking. John Pilger's come in. It was a completely different world. There was no argument. Which example should actually be a representative of what was going out in the future? And that was John Pilger's.
They agreed, almost unanimously, I think it was unanimously, that there wasn't any contest between the two dummies, that the one that I'd drawn up with Alan was the way we want to go. I proposed that we cut our losses and pay Keith off and start again.
So you wanted him sacked at that point?
Yes.
But the way the paper was structured meant that no one could sack the editor without the founders' say-so.
I think the Founders Committee met and they came to this kind of extraordinary decision, which was that Keith Sutton should be told to produce a newspaper along the lines of the Hayling Pilger dummy. And that was their decision. And of course, as a result, John Pilger resigned instantly, absolutely instantly. And so should have I, but I didn't.
Having walked out, Pilger went public and penned a series of articles attacking the paper.
He walked away and frankly stabbed us in the back. I think it was vindictive and it was an extremely nasty thing to do.
That decision to go public was considered a terrible act of betrayal. Why did you go public?
Well, the act of betrayal was on the part of those who had turned this dream into a really tatty left-wing Sun. It wasn't even left-wing. That was the betrayal.
The chances of the thing succeeding were 5 to 10% probably anyway. That 5 and 10% was narrowed to, I would say, 1 to 2% by John Pilger then going outside of our tent and lobbing hand grenades at us.
News on Sunday will support workers and their trade unions when they take industrial action, except insofar as action is in direct conflict with the principles of the Charter.
News on Sunday opposes the imposition of suffering on animals in pursuit of profit or pleasure.
The paper will support groups of people seeking to gain more control over their own lives.
Tell me about the advertising campaign.
In an inspired move, News on Sunday hired Bartle, Bogle and Hegarty to do their advertising. They were a fashionable young agency, best known at the time for their Levi's campaign.
We were excited about the fact that there was this trendy advertising agency who was going to do this campaign for us.
Well, when we've met the team from the News on Sunday, obviously that there was a tremendous amount of passion in what they were trying to do, which is great, which is really good, which you need that when you're launching any brand. Doesn't matter what you're doing, from toothpaste to newspapers. I mean, you have to have passion behind what you're trying to do. So there was an opportunity, I felt, for us. And I said to the team, why don't we focus on this idea that, we're not going to have a page 3 girl, and actually we're going to have quite gutsy political writing. And out of that emerged the line, no tits but lots of balls, which I thought was a fabulous line. I thought was one of the best lines that we'd ever written.
I remember this John Hegarty coming, this flash, advertising guy, blonde hair and sharp suit and everything, up from London, And we were all assembled and we had to watch this video presentation, and, which had obviously cost an absolute fortune.
When we actually saw this line, no tits but a lot of balls, there was sort of sharp intakes of breath and feeling, well, we really can't go with this.
There was a kind of stunned silence. There was a kind of an even greater fear. You could sort of saw fear across their faces. Oh my God, the reality of it.
An awful lot of people didn't like it. They were appalled. The more sort of earnest, if you like, people on the project, and I think probably certainly some of the feminists, although not all of them necessarily, just thought this was terrible, 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 and to the extent of threatening to resign if it was used.
It seemed to undermine everything that we were trying to achieve at that time. We weren't going to be the Mirror, the Sun. We weren't going to go to the lowest denominator. We were going to be an intelligent newspaper, but which was tabloid, which was small, with vocabulary that could be understood by everybody. So to have a no-tits campaign was just aping the enemy.
What was your reaction to that?
I thought it was appalling. I really did. I mean, it's clever and sexy and all those kind of things, but I mean, it was anathema to, I thought, what the politics of that paper and the equal opportunities intent of the organisation.
Can you explain why?
Because it's making a sort of crude allusion to women and their sexual parts of their body in order to sell a newspaper. I mean, it's no better than putting a nude on the top of a car at a car show. It seems to me it's raising the sexual frisson in order to sell something which has nothing to do with sex.
In the end, News on Sunday settled for a watered-down version of the campaign. The TV ads, however, inexplicably featured references to the tits and balls of the defunct slogan.
Hello, John Blunt. I hand you the truth. And so does News on Sunday. A new paper that's on our side. News on Sunday will have football, snooker balls, tennis balls, hockey balls. In fact, pages and pages of sport. And it'll expose everything. Except girls on page 3. So, if you want the naked truth instead of naked women, read News on Sunday. This Sunday.
The debacle over the advertising campaign revealed a deeper problem at the paper, namely that there was no effective leadership and decisions were being made by committee.
The structure of the organisation was ridiculous, the decision-making structure. There was the slap of firm management was totally absent. There was always somebody else you could appeal to. No decision ever seemed to be final. And you had this awful problem with people who would make a statement in one meeting which would accept a practical idea or would back something, and then they would make a statement to another meeting where they'd hammer away on the left-wing principles and how, we can't change, we mustn't do this is utterly, utterly wrong. It didn't make for smooth running.
But why is a picture of a demo going to be a good picture?
Well, I've said there might be, because the demos that are taking place in London usually end up outside the police station.
So you had the likes of Keith Sutton, Colton Lee, me, all arguing about our causes, but actually they were all clashing. What we needed was a leader who said, look, I hear what you say, but this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, the problem with this piece is that it's showing working class people again as victims. I don't think we can let it go like that.
Well, I don't think it does, and we've got some very positive comments there from some of the unemployed people.
The leader they might have looked to was Alan Hayling, but he was no longer chief executive. Since Pilger's departure, he'd reinvented himself as editorial director.
He changed titles and responsibilities throughout the period I was there, usually due to criticisms of various groups, or possibly all groups, of his activities and behaviour. So it was a very odd situation that there was this man who everybody thought was running the organisation. Even if he said he wasn't, they would always turn to him thinking that he was, and even if he wasn't supposed to be running the organisation, he would be always interfering and trying to run it.
I'd say I was able to have practically no influence whatsoever on the way that the paper developed from January. None. Really none.
So you were trying to have influence?
But nobody was listening.
Hayling had a very theoretical, political idea about what the paper should be, and I just think, a lot of the kind of crap that he was talking about is the kiss of death to a broad, a paper that's going to appeal to a broad audience. A lot of the kind of things that he might have been concerned about, people out there couldn't give a piss about. I'm not interested in.
I think it was the great divide, which was always problematic for News on Sunday, in which the founders, the people who had this great sort of political dream for a newspaper, and then the workers who were actually trying to produce it, and these conflicts became evident as we moved towards publication.
If we persist in using these left-right terms, these were people who were way out here. I hesitate to use the word loony, but it was a very popular word at the time.
You'd see them because they would wander around the newsroom, sort of vaguely checking up on people, I suppose. I remember one of them coming up to me saying, "Who are you?" and "What are you supposed to be doing?" and me saying, "Oh, who are you?" And he said he was a founder, and he had some sort of badge on. I think he had a picture of Lenin on it.
I think most of the staff, there was a kind of resentment, but then unsure of just what were we about, what we were doing there. Here was a group of people that weren't getting paid, that had these powers. It was phenomenal.
Do you think that the founders were equipped to help sort out the content of the paper?
We were more able than I think the journalists, because it's the people who make cars are not the ones who say it's the best car in the world. It's the people who buy them. They're the ones who actually judge them. And with a newspaper, it's the same thing, and News on Sunday was exactly the same.
For us, though, it was how are you going to put in the ideas embraced in the editorial charter? That was the main thing.
But the weekly dummies that Sutton was continuing to produce were reinforcing the fear that the paper's original vision was by now irretrievably lost.
Division that had by then become a very, very wide one between the staff, and especially Keith's people and himself, and the people who set the project up. There was by then an absolute total mismatch between them. And it was by then obvious the paper was not going to be the paper we wanted, and I'm afraid was not going to be even a good paper.
I ceased to be employed, a paid employee of the newspaper, as I recall, about 2 weeks before publication. In other words, I stepped down as editorial director because I didn't think that the paper would in any way represent my ambitions for the paper, and I didn't want to be associated with it.
As the paper stumbled towards launch with its left-wing sensibilities in tatters, its commitment to equal opportunities nevertheless remained intact.
I remember just before the paper launched, when you might expect everybody to be frantically working, to get out deadlines and was stories we were going to run. I remember suddenly the office was half empty one afternoon. I thought, this is interesting. I wonder where everyone's gone. And everybody was sent off on a deafness awareness course for the afternoon, just before we were about to launch a paper. So I said to one of the people, what is a deafness awareness course? And I think they walked around the streets of Manchester with earplugs. I think that's what the course was about. I thought, well, okay, well.
On Sunday, April the 26th, 1987, News on Sunday's first issue hit the streets.
The launch issue, I got up in the morning and read it through from cover to cover. I thought this is actually rather good. I thought there was a lot of energy in it. The problem, though, was that it didn't really have any sort of real news.
What one would have loved would have been, some grand disaster, I suppose, which sells all newspapers. Given the absence of that, as somebody once said, there is no news on Sunday because things don't happen on Saturday.
In the absence of a big topical story, the paper led with an article about a man in Brazil who was selling his kidney.
The front page splashes I thought was a bit feeble because here's a bloke selling his kidney. A jobless youngster is selling his kidney, is so desperate. And I thought, can this be Mrs. Thatcher's Britain again? Because this is a left-wing paper, that's the difference. But it happened in Brazil, and Keith, it's a bit far away there. I mean, you expect things like that to happen in Brazil.
Now, the kidneys for sale would obviously have been better if it had been in Tooting or Leeds, and sadly it was in Buenos Aires, but I'm afraid it was the best that we could come up with.
I think we'd all accept that's awful, and for people to have to do that is unacceptable. But equally, we're in the UK, and it's Sunday, and people read their papers over their breakfast.
I thought it was absolutely ludicrous on a Sunday morning. Ludicrous. People don't want to wake up on a Sunday morning. They want to read the Observer or the Sunday Times because they're serious-minded people, and all that. But you don't open a tabloid newspaper with a picture of a Brazilian who's just sold his kidney.
I thought it was adequate but fairly unexciting and pretty bland.
Nondescript. Wasn't going to survive.
It was, without question, the dullest paper you could ever wish to read.
I just thought the first issue was terrible, really terrible. It was kind of a little bit small-minded. It was, the writing wasn't fantastic. The use of pictures was ordinary. It was very disappointing.
Very, very, very disillusioning. Very, very disappointing. Hugely. Massively.
I wasn't surprised. It was so bad.
In order to survive, the paper had to sell over 800,000 copies a week. The first issue fell disastrously short and sold just over 500,000. By the second week, this had fallen further, and by the end of the first month, circulation was down to 200,000.
Were you all feeling sick at this point that all this public sector money might be lost?
Absolutely desperate, yeah. That the jobs would be lost, that the public sector money would be lost, all of it. I was as close to a breakdown at that point as I've ever been.
These problems at the paper had wider ramifications. The general election was only a couple of weeks away, and the left believed that Neil Kinnock had a genuine chance of deposing Margaret Thatcher.
People were terrified that the paper would go bust during the general election. The whole issue in the 1987 election was the competence of Neil Kinnock and the Labour Party. The Tory line was he was incompetent. So if News on Sunday went down during the general election due to poor business practice and inefficiency on such a huge scale, it was potentially a very bad embarrassment for the Labour Party. So everything had to be done to kind of hush it up a bit and make sure that the crash happened after the election.
Money was needed to keep the paper afloat, so News on Sunday turned again to its original backers. Still hoping that sales could rally, the Transport and General Workers Union and aspiring media tycoon Owen Oyston both agreed to bankroll the paper until after polling day.
We knew that the project was in serious danger of collapse. We knew that it hadn't worked in the way we wanted it to work, but we still knew we had a little bit of time to play for to maybe keep some of the elements of our original project alive.
Hello, good afternoon. The Conservatives have won the 1987 general election and will lead Britain into the 1990s with a parliamentary majority of over 100 seats.
After just 8 issues, it was clear that News on Sunday was well and truly bankrupt. Owen Oyston offered to buy the paper, but before he could take over, the founders had to agree to give up their golden share. The founders made one heroic last stand, fighting to retain their role and retain the charter.
Truth was that Owen Oyston was there offering to bail the thing out and said unless we gave in, he would walk away. It was a real gun to the head and a real eyeball-to-eyeball stuff.
There was a script read out. It was a fait accompli, that we must give up the rights by midnight that night, or Owen Oyston walks away from the company on Monday.
But we were quite clear that we weren't going to do that. We wouldn't give up the golden share. That was it.
Owen Oyston resigned on Monday the 15th of June, and on the 16th of June the board met. I think the meeting was extremely brief and the paper went into receivership.
Come on, all you women and men, Henry Ford's...
News on Sunday was a £6.5 million failure, and all the money that had been invested by the trade union movement and local authority pension funds was now lost.
On the basic rate, and it's 1, 2, 3, what are we fighting for? You can stop your 5%, 'cause that won't pay the rent. And it's 5, 6, 7, picketing the factory gates. It's 1 in the eye for Sonny Jim. Whoopee, we're gonna win.
I was quite ashamed, actually. Not only individuals, we'd let what we'd believed in go. The trade union movement had been let down. We didn't produce what we promised we would produce.
I was really upset at News on Sunday not bringing in the Labour Party at the next election. I was devastated, seriously.
It felt at the time like, all my dreams had been lost and I could never have a big dream again. I could never
hope for something. You know, I felt crushed.
I felt the opposite of "I told you so." It's interesting. I didn't feel any of that. I felt really sad. A bit angry, just a bit, but mostly sad.
Was it your fault that News on Sunday failed?
I don't think... I think there are a number of things... I don't think it was my fault that News on Sunday failed. It was a failure mainly because it was an editorial failure. But, you know, I fought and fought and fought and fought. And I think if people had listened, then it would have been a different story.
Maybe this was part of the decline of the left in the latter part of the 20th century. You know, that's also possible. I mean,
you were on the wrong side of history.
Yes, it could be. Yeah.
As a political project, News on Sunday came at the wrong time because it attempted to promote a kind of old Labourism which was reflective in the kind of solidarities which were already being undermined. The miners had just been defeated. Margaret Thatcher was riding high. We had the Falklands War. The consolidation on the right was quite powerful. And the left needed to cut with that grain in order to survive. And fortunately, the Labour Party was moving into a position to make it more realistic in terms of the real world they were living in. Whereas we were promoting a kind of politics which came from an era which was really finished. And in a sense, I think News on Sunday really was the end of an era rather than the beginning of one.
In June '87, Owen Oyston bought News on Sunday from the receiver, but closed it down just 5 months later, having lost a further £2 million. He subsequently went to prison for raping a 16-year-old girl. Keith Sutton now works for the Cumbrian Newspaper Group and is editorial director of 7 regional newspapers. Alan Hayling is currently head of documentaries at the BBC.
Everyone seems to know the song. They've seen it all before. I'm sure they know the boats are gonna throw it away, gonna blow it away. But I know we can say we remember Bertie's sides are down. The dockers are still fighting. Join that leadership. Cause it's not bringing. Oh well, they were the days.